Guys, welcome to the Web3 Podcast. I'm Cade, host of the Web3 Spaces, and this is Charlie, COO of Wolf Financial. Today we're talking about Stacks, their Bitcoin L2 company enabling smart contracts and apps with Bitcoin as the secure base layer. So with all the talks of Bitcoin, with altcoins, meme coins, these guys doubled down for years, building out the Stacks ecosystem on capital B Bitcoin. So today we have the pleasure of speaking with one of the people building that future as they prepare for the big Nakamoto release on the Bitcoin halving coming up. Man, what a time to be alive, dude. We have Kenny from Dev Relations. Can't wait to get in the conversation. I'll let Charlie take it from here. But first, Kenny, thank you for being here, man. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Excited to be here.
Thank you so much. Yeah, definitely. I think we had kind of dove into your ecosystem pretty heavily from our side of the team for, I don't know, we had like 72 hours to figure out top to bottom how to not necessarily sound intelligent because it only gets you so far, but to really understand with a million there really is so many blockchains coming out, and even now they have insta blockchains. I was talking to a company where you can go to another company, you can resource, get a brand new blockchain created for your company in a second, and then basically launch right away. And so I guess, first things first, in a preference of 5 minutes, what do you think Stacks is clearly as a company and why it exists?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to dig into with that is that one of the things that drew me into the Stacks ecosystem in the first place is that Stacks itself is not a single company. It's a protocol and an actually decentralized ecosystem, which is a big part of what drew me to in the first place, because to dive into the answer to your question, what I really view Stacks, the protocol, as, and then we can dig into how I view the foundation next. But how I view Stacks, the protocol, is really, how do we take this super stable, hard, secure money, Bitcoin, and how do we then deploy that into the world to make it more usable, to make it more accessible, to be able to basically take that money, build an economy on top of it, but build that economy in a way that's just as decentralized as the money itself. And so that's kind of what I would say is the core ethos of Stacks. Because if you have any experience using Bitcoin, it's difficult. And it's difficult for technical people, let alone somebody that is used to just using, basic banking apps all day. Bitcoin's difficult to use. And then so what we end up seeing is that a huge amount of the Bitcoin that people own and use is done in a custodial, primarily centralized way, which the money itself is decentralized, and that's great. But in order to really realize the full value of that, I think the systems that we build on top of it need to be decentralized as well. And so that's where I think the layer 2 ecosystem comes in and where Stacks comes in. And then as far as the Stacks Foundation, which is the entity that I work for, it's one of several entities actually building in the Stacks ecosystem. And what we really focus on is the education and community aspect. So me in developer relations, I do a lot of developer education. So I do a lot of tutorials, I work on documentation, I do workshops, hackathons, community growth and outreach, all that kind of stuff. But yeah, the foundation is really focused on more of the educational and community side of things that can't necessarily be monetized. And what we really like to do is try to provide support for the other companies that are building in the ecosystem to get them the resources that they need to have them be successful. So the more entities we have in Stacks ecosystem taking on more responsibilities, the better. And so our role is really, how do we empower them to do what they want to do?
Wow. Yeah. Okay. So I guess from the perspective, the company or not company is broken down into two perspectives. There's the Stack Foundation and then the Stacks protocol. And then they're kind of separate as a whole.
Yeah, because we don't actually at the foundation, we have me on developer relations, we've got a research scientist, we've got developers, we have people that work on the protocol, but we can't just unilaterally make decisions about what happens with the Stacks protocol. That's actually a community effort. So for example, the big upgrade we have coming up, Nakamoto, a bunch of different people from different organizations in the ecosystem, us, the foundation, Hero, developer tooling company, Trust Machines is another company building on a lot of stuff. And then we have a bunch of other DeFi protocols and contract work developers and freelancers and all these different people that participate in the community basically all came together and proposed and collaborated on the design for Nakamoto, wrote it all down, and then that had to be proposed to the community to vote on. So Stacks holders actually had to vote on that for it to be basically like, okay, we're going to go ahead and actually implement this change now. And so, yeah, when you talk about the foundation as the entity versus Stacks as the protocol, we're one of several entities that are building in the ecosystem and trying to kind of drive the chain forward and drive the protocol forward to see it succeed.
Interesting. Wow. And this kind of like lines up with the Bitcoin ethos where you don't want a centralized figure kind of moving the needle. Because I know with proof of stake, I think the original intention for Ethereum was to be proof of work and decentralized. But when you move to POS, you become centralized, correct? Like you have a central figure that can make like unilateral decisions. But with you guys, it's different.
And I think that's not quite giving Ethereum enough credit. They are, so one of the reasons that I do prefer, like obviously I'm working in the Bitcoin ecosystem. I do prefer Bitcoin over Ethereum. I like proof of work better than proof of stake, not because it's just a binary decentralized versus centralized. I just think that proof of stake with the incentive mechanisms that are built in, it has more of a tendency towards centralization. So if we're looking at this from a hyper long-term angle of what's the financial system going to look like in 1, 2, 500 years, I don't want that to be built on a system that drifts towards centralization over time. I want it to be built on a system that drifts further towards decentralization. So if you look at, without getting too far into it, you look at how staking works and these liquid staking providers, one of them like Lido, they control like over 33% of staked ETH. And once you hit that threshold, now you've hit a liveness ratio where the liveness of the Ethereum chain itself now rests on Lido functioning correctly, because if more than 33% of those validators are not participating, the chain halts. And so now you're looking at, even though there are thousands of people staking through Lido, and that part of it is decentralized, there's a risk now that the liveness of the chain is now resting on Ethereum and also on Lido functioning correctly without having to go through a bunch of different changes. And proof of stake is also just, it's extremely complicated. The more complex something gets, the more attack surfaces there are. And so I really like to go with the ethos of keep the money itself at the L1 as simple and stable and secure as possible, change it very, very slowly, and only for really, really good reasons. And let's do all the experimentation at the layer 2 level where we can add in some more functionality and stuff without, risking the layer 1 having anything catastrophic happen as a result of that experimentation.
Wow, definitely. I could see that. Ethereum's running risks by iterating on the layer 1 instead of iterating on a layer 2, because once you kind of go down that pathway to roll it back, it's pretty tough.
Yeah, and it's just, I remember a quote from one of the key people in Ethereum working on like one of the major tooling companies for it. He called Ethereum a behemoth of unknowns, basically meaning that like there's probably a very, very small handful of people, if anybody, that understands the entire Ethereum code base from start to finish. And that's just because it's so massive, so complex, and that a lot of that is necessary. And I'm not even denying that it's like an amazing technological achievement. It is. It's extremely impressive. I just don't necessarily think that something that complex that has to be constantly iterated on in order to fix things as that complexity grows is necessarily a good thing for that base level that we're talking about when we're talking about what is ideally supposed to be money that's backing like a decentralized economy for hopefully the whole world.
Wow, very interesting. Yeah, sorry, I got a little off base, but that is, I had never really thought it that way. So I guess question number 2. So we've seen a million things pop up with DeFi, crypto, money making in this sector, but what is the core of decentralized finance and why does that do well on Stacks?
Yeah, to me, the core of decentralized finance is how can we take this decentralized money and build an economic system on top of it that is also decentralized. And so this is where one of the really interesting things about Ethereum's backstory is that Vitalik and the other creators of Ethereum went to the Bitcoin community first and basically pitched this idea of, hey, there's this technology. Yes, it's great money, but it has a lot more potential to be more than that also. And it was ultimately rejected by the Bitcoin community for a lot of the same reasons as what we just talked about, that it's just too much complexity, it's too much risk to introduce. And so then they went off and started Ethereum. Well, since they've done that, they've proved out this use case for decentralized finance. Like, it's exploded. If you look at like the market cap of actual decentralized apps built on top of Ethereum, it's huge. And the Bitcoin version of that, the Bitcoin app ecosystem, is almost non-existent, even though the market cap is more than double, I think, at this point. And so what I think that proved out is, like, yes, there's a ton of opportunity to make money with that, being an early adopter and getting into some of these protocols. Of course, that comes with risk too. If you're an early adopter like that, there's always going to be the ability, you're going to have to weigh the pros and cons there. But sort of bigger picture, long term, and the reason that I was drawn to Bitcoin in the first place is that what I really think it does is it allows us to subvert what I think is a corrupt financial system. If you look at people like Alex Gladstein, he's a Bitcoiner that works for the Human Rights Foundation. He's written several books on looking at Bitcoin from the human rights angle. And how does it give people that don't have the financial opportunities that we have, how does it give them the upper hand and give them a fair shot at actually like just owning their own money, which seems like such a basic simple thing. But there's literally hundreds of millions, if not billions, of people around the world that don't have that like basic banking access. They just can't have their own money because either there's restrictions on it or their government has destroyed it so badly that hyperinflation makes it basically worthless. Yes. And so you look at how economies grow, and I think it's pretty important that you have a good credit system in place for economies to grow well. But that credit system should be based on money that cannot be inflated arbitrarily. So if that credit system is based on a system where the money can just be created out of thin air, that's where you get into trouble. And that's where you start to see stuff, spiraling out of control. But if you have a credit system where it's built on immutable money, where I just, as an entrepreneur, I can go take out a loan to start this business, but I'm not sitting here next to the money printer getting fed endless amounts of newly printed money because I happen to know the right people. And so a little bit of a roundabout way of saying, I think for me, the core of decentralized finance is how can we, sort of along the same lines as the Bitcoin ethos, how can we combine creating like a fair, transparent, open financial system with also creating a ton of opportunity for people that are interested in genuinely creating value for the world through that system. If you look at Bitcoin, one of the really cool things that it did was it turned, I use this word not with a negative connotation, but it turned greed, or just like the profit motive, it turned it into a good thing. Because now you as a miner want to make money with Bitcoin, but at the same time, you're contributing to now this decentralized network. So how can we build a system where the profit motive ends up creating more good for people? And I think that the way to do that is to have an economy that's built on decentralized money, and to have that economy be decentralized as well. And then that's where I think Stacks comes in, is we go back to the idea of how do we keep the L1 secure and add experimentation and functionality at the L2. This is what I really like about the way Stacks does things, is it's kind of taken this iterative approach to, hey, what's the best way to actually do that, to actually provide additional functionality and to provide additional scalability at this layer 2? And what does that look like from a technology perspective of what we can accomplish right now? And then as technology improves over time, let's continue to iterate on that and make it more decentralized over time and more functional over time and more scalable over time. And so I really like the way that Stacks does that. We can kind of dig into the technical details of exactly how it accomplishes that later. But from the reason that I chose to work in the Stacks ecosystem is because I think that it is the best way to actually achieve that vision of how do we build a decentralized economy on top of that decentralized money.
I think this is kind of a good segue, just because I think it's up a little bit right now. But in a lot of your documentation, when we were reading through, you guys, you talked about how you can try to use altruism to get people to build a blockchain that's good for all parties involved. But if you can use monetary incentive to build something that's at its core altruistic, you're in a better situation. It's so interesting. I hadn't heard the parallels from BTC and Bitcoin with you guys until just now, but that seems like that's the parallel you guys are running. Because not to get like too deep into it, but with proof of transfer, you guys are basically using like risk for people that are sending a certain amount of BTC to transfer it, and then you're getting rewarded in stacks. And so I guess for you guys is like the modus operandi, or like the way in which you're doing things is to mimic that same core idea. Like, let's incentivize people with like not necessarily greed, but monetarily, so that they can support something that we believe is a vision that's greater than money itself. Not to get like too but is that kind of what the thought is there?
But yeah, I think that's a good way to put just the ethos behind the specific mechanism that Stacks chose, because that is something that we, especially from a lot of the Bitcoin maxi community, get a lot of flack for, is that we have our own token. And for a lot of people, that's like by default, if you have your own token, you're in it for the wrong reasons, because it should be Bitcoin only and nothing else. But if you look at, there's always trade-offs to everything. So if you look at this concept of like the Bitcoin layer 2 trilemma, there's basically three properties that you can choose between as a Bitcoin L2. You want to have an open network, or you can have a closed network. You can have a token or no token, and then you can have basically increased functionality or the same functionality as Bitcoin. So you look at, and you can really only pick two of these things. So if you look at something like Lightning, it's an open network and it doesn't have a token, but it doesn't increase the functionality of Bitcoin. It scales the existing functionality, it doesn't add anything to it. If you look at something else like, say, Liquid, for example, Liquid doesn't have a token. It does increase the functionality, but it's a federated network. There's a closed network of participants that are actually validating and producing the blocks on Liquid. And then Stacks is on the end, where we increase the functionality and we do have our own token. And because of that, we're able to have an open network. And the reason that a token allows us to have an open network is, again, just like Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a token, and it incentivizes people to mine new Bitcoin and to, most importantly, maintain the history of the chain on their nodes. So same thing, how do you build an open network without relying on altruism? Well, you need to introduce some sort of incentive mechanism. And so that's really where the token came from. And again, that's just a difference in approaches, and why I was drawn to Stacks is because I do think that it's extremely important to have that open network of participation, because that is the surest path to true decentralization, is making sure that anybody that wants to participate in producing new blocks or validating those blocks can do so. And really the only way to actually realistically bootstrap that process is to provide an incentive.
And I hear that conversation a lot. So it's cool that you guys come in with that, but then also have a solution to it. You're like, okay, here's the thing that we've been talking about. Everyone's talking about it. It's all these side conversations, but you guys come with a solution, which is very different. So that's very cool.
It's interesting, and I hadn't realized this, but Lightning Network doesn't have the opportunity to produce a blockchain because they don't have an incentive model other than probably the trading fees that they would receive on their platform. And so you have to have an incentive model to support an existing blockchain, which offers the opportunity for smart contracts. So that's the trade-off. Like Lightning doesn't, they can't, what are they going to reward people with to support their blockchain or support their ecosystem as a whole? And so, yeah, I kind of see they can only do so much, basically.
Yeah, because what's a blockchain? It's a perpetual ledger of every transaction that's ever happened. And in order to have people maintain that, you have to provide some sort of incentive. Lightning is ephemeral. So if I open a Lightning channel with you and then we settle it and close it, that's it. There's no record of what happened in that Lightning channel, only the record of the opening and closing of it, because that's what's written to Bitcoin. So if you want to have that same historical ledger of every transaction happening in between, then you need to have a blockchain where you're actually recording every single one of those transactions, and then you need incentives to basically incentivize people to continue producing those and to maintain them historically too.
Very interesting. Yeah. I want to get too ethereal on this, but I think that like having a borderless currency is absolutely necessary. If you look at any monetary like value that's attached to a nation, it always goes south at some point because the nation goes south. I just think that there's basically no way to really extend a currency beyond its life of the nation without it having like borderless and decentralized truly. So
And then also, I was
yeah,
going to
I
say
think
real quick, it's like just to give like a
please.
philosophical take, then we'll get back to it. Something you notice is with society, there's sometimes this negative outlook on the future based on, you know, what's going on. And so people say, well, we'll just throw their hands up and just give up. But you're like, okay, well, you can do that, or you can pursue the ultimate top goal, like whatever is the ideal, which with crypto was always the decentralized nature of it. We got away from that because certain hoops you have to jump through. You've got to accept certain things. You've got to pander to certain people. But if you don't have someone, and ideally it would be Bitcoin, and so it's good that it's Bitcoin and people building there, the OGs, you know, and people are like showing up. They're like, all right, guys, it's time. Let's get to work. Let's do the thing, and let's lead this way. That way, at least a portion of people who came from crypto for this certain reason have someone to look for. And if you get rid of it entirely, then crypto sort of loses its edge, you know?
Right. Yeah. Yep. I agree.
Cool. Well, I kind of went around the mountain a little bit, but I'd like to get into the tech, side of it and kind of what happened pre Nakamoto and Nakamoto. Can you, I guess, break down for us in layman terms what was going on with the Stacks chain on top of Bitcoin pre this new release that you guys have? I want to take it from a perspective of completely ignorant, like somebody has no adoption, they don't understand. Like, what are you guys doing on top of BTC, and how are you facilitating like finance related lending, borrowing, staking? Like, how are you guys doing that on top of Bitcoin, pre this new release? And then we'll move into that after.
Yeah. So let's start with the concept of proof of transfer. So Bitcoin operates on the proof of work consensus mechanism, and then Stacks operates on proof of transfer. And so the way to think about proof of transfer is it's basically the goal is to programmatically recreate the process of proof of work on the Stacks chain. And so going back to proof of work, how is Bitcoin actually mined? The way that it's mined is that Bitcoin miners will take one external resource, in this case, it's just energy, and they'll spend that in order for a chance to mine new Bitcoin and be rewarded with that Bitcoin. So then what Stacks does as an L2 is it takes that one level up, and the way that you mine new Stacks tokens is by spending Bitcoin for a chance to win the block reward of mining the new Stacks tokens, and then in turn append the next block to the Stacks chain. And so it does that through a verifiable random function to where the more Bitcoin you spend, the more likely you are to mine the next Stacks block. Not guaranteed to if you spend the most, but it just weights that randomized function a little bit. And so the goal really there is to try to recreate this concept in Bitcoin of the ability to create these new tokens needs to be tied to some immutable external resource. And so that's another big differentiator between something like proof of work and proof of stake is you have to spend an external resource in order to create this new resource. And so Stacks was really trying to, how do we recreate that same concept, but programmatically at the layer 2 level? And then the next major component of it, I think, is probably Clarity, which is a smart contract language. And this is how we just add that functionality piece. So we were talking about before, one of the goals of a layer 2 should be to add this functionality. Well, the primary reason that we want to do that is because we want to be able to write these smart contracts that get published up to the blockchain that are transparent and visible and immutable. And we want those to be able to handle people's interactions with their money. That's kind of what the whole DeFi ecosystem is built on, that idea. And so Clarity is a smart contract language that's really designed to do that as simply and securely as possible. So it's kind of purpose built from the ground up to be easy to write and safe and secure so that we can write smart contracts that aren't as vulnerable to bugs and to exploits. And so that's kind of the way that Stacks adds that functionality piece. But there's really two major problems that were identified with the way that this is designed. One is that one of the other main things that an L2 should accomplish is scalability. It should make the asset at the L1 easier to use and faster to use. If you look at networks like Solana, the transaction confirmation time on Solana is extremely fast. Like, it's near instantaneous. I think it's just a few seconds. And so that's really what users have come to expect both from a Web2 world where you're just interacting with a standard application, but then also from the Web3 world now with chains like Solana. And so with the proof of transfer consensus mechanism I just outlined, what it meant was that Stacks blocks are mined in lockstep with Bitcoin blocks, which means that they take as long as Bitcoin blocks do. And so what this caused over time was, what it basically meant was that if I as a Stacks user want to initiate a Stacks transaction, I have to wait on Bitcoin for that transaction to be confirmed. And so that was kind of the downside of locking Stacks blocks with the Bitcoin blocks, because part of the Stacks protocol operating was that every block that was appended to the chain, a hash of that block would then get written back to the Bitcoin chain, and that was how we maintained that historical verifiability of the Stacks chain. That's how it was anchored to Bitcoin security. But the two problems that caused were slow transaction times, and then the second was that it only kind of achieved what we might call like Bitcoin finality, which is how I define Bitcoin finality is as an L2, as a user of that L2, I can be as sure of the settlement of my transaction as I am of a Bitcoin transaction. And so that's kind of how I define that. But the way that Stacks works before the Nakamoto release is that it can fork on its own. So if I'm a Stacks miner and I want to come in and I want to basically fork and start my own version of the Stacks chain, my security budget only needs to be as high as Stacks security budget to do that. I don't actually care. I don't need to care about reorging the history of the Bitcoin chain at all to do that. Because even though the history is recorded, if I'm a new miner that comes in and says, actually, I'm going to make this the canonical chain tip now, well, then that's where Stacks is going to be going forward. And so I still have some ability to control the actual like structure and canonical chain tip, which is the agreed upon chain tip. And so those were the two major drawbacks, were the slow transaction times, and Stacks really had a separate security budget from Bitcoin. You could attack the Stacks network by only spending enough to conduct a 51% attack on Stacks. You didn't have to spend enough to conduct a 51% attack on Bitcoin. So those are kind of the two major drawbacks of the design, pre-Nakamoto.
Okay, so when you guys first built, you built on smart contracts, and you used the Bitcoin layer 2 finality of proof of work to put y'all's transactions into a Bitcoin block so that it can't ever be rolled back because you have the security of Bitcoin. But the problem with just having all your transactions rolled up into a single block is that it gave you smart contract ability, but it also gave you Bitcoin speed. So you didn't have fast throughput, but you had capacity. Is that correct?
Yep. Yeah. So the throughput was pretty slow. And what that would mean is that if we had, say, like a spike in activity on the network, your transaction could be delayed for several Bitcoin blocks because there's only so much space that a single X box can have for transactions. So what you'd have to do is basically when you broadcast a transaction, it goes up to what's called the mempool, and that's where all the transactions are just floating around waiting to be put into a block. But if the block times are slow, then that mempool gets clogged up and it fills up more and more and more. And those transactions are going to be pulled into blocks primarily based on the fee, because that's the miner's incentive to pull the transaction into a block, but also based on just time that they were added to the mempool, and if the fees are all else being equal. And so that just caused a lot of congestion, primarily because of the throughput. So even though a lot of transactions could be added to it and we had that additional functionality, because we would have to wait for Bitcoin blocks, that mempool would get really congested because there's a finite amount of transactions that can fit into a Stacks block.
Wow. Okay. So to break this down, you transactions could be sent, but they were inherently slow to reach finality. So if somebody sent money to another person, before it resolved in their wallet, it would take a Bitcoin block resolution to see that money in your wallet. Is that correct?
Yeah, so basically what you would see if you were to use, like, let's say Lether, for example, is a Bitcoin wallet that also that integrates Stacks as well. If I was to send you 100 stacks using Lether and I went to go to the block explorer to check on that transaction, it would just say in mempool and it wouldn't actually be considered finalized until that next Bitcoin block arrived. And 10 minutes is the average for Bitcoin blocks. I've seen Bitcoin blocks, especially on testnet, take, an hour and a half, 2 hours sometimes. And so that's just not a good user experience. Like it just isn't. And so that was one of the primary things that needed to be resolved. It's again one of those trade-offs of like we've got the Bitcoin anchoring, we've got the Bitcoin security, but now we need to address the block times and the user experience. And so that's where Nakamoto comes in, is adding some changes to address that.
Yeah, Charlie, I think we should test that out. Maybe send me 100 stacks real quick, and I'll just, if it works, I'll confirm it, and then I'll just move on with my life. All right.
Right. That's exactly it. Wow, this is really cool. So you guys put smart contract functionality so people could lend, they could borrow, they could do decentralized finance on the chain, but anything that required like high throughput or like fast transactions end up getting hampered. And then even more so on a second level, if you didn't put a high fee in your transaction, a lot of times your transaction would be stuck basically in the mempool, not getting dragged down into the blockchain because the higher fee ones are getting pushed because you have a maximum amount of transactions that can be hashed on each stack's blockchain and then put into Bitcoin. Is that kind of clear?
Yep.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay,
I think you got it. And then that also causes, accessibility and scalability issues, because we saw this with Ethereum where transaction fees, and we've seen it on Bitcoin too, transaction fees get so high that you just can't use it as like an everyday user just trying to do a basic transaction, which also defeats a big part of the purpose of an L2. If we've got transaction fees that are so high that me trying to send money to somebody, it's costing, 10, 15, 20% of the amount that I'm trying to send, then that's just not feasible either. And so the transaction fees are kind of a secondary effect of that need to be addressed as well.
And yeah, wow. And it produces a higher need for understanding. Because if you look at like Web 2, and I won't go too much into this, but Web 2 is so often synonymous with ignorance. Like everybody has governing bodies so that people don't have to understand the protocols and the things that they're putting in place. This goes for like if somebody steals your money in a Web 2 environment, well, you call the police, you call the FBI. You have governing bodies that take care of your safety, that you didn't have to keep your money safe yourself. Well, that doesn't really happen in crypto, but the idea is that people don't really know what they need to know. So if the transaction fee needs to be higher, then people have to understand what the throughput is currently on the chain for how much they need to make the fee. They need to start understanding a lot more about the blockchain, and it makes like low level ignorant adoption very hard to find, because it's like, now I have to start understanding what the fee rate is to get put into the chain. So yeah, I don't want to go too much into that, but okay. So you're pre Nakamoto, you've got smart contract functionality, you've got the ability for people to build on top of Bitcoin, you've kept it decentralized, you've really kept the ethos of BTC intact, but your throughput, your transaction time, and also the ability for miners to choose the chain's tip and to choose what block actually gets accepted on the chain was kind of causing issues. So that moves over into Nakamoto, where you fixed transaction time and then you fixed the canonical tip to the chain. Can you kind of open that up, how you guys fixed that, what happened, pre into, post Nakamoto, and how that works?
Yeah, so now we kind of get into the next iteration of Stacks' life cycle as a protocol of, okay, we've built out this system that's a layer 2 that's built on top of Bitcoin. Now, how do we get the best of both worlds, where we have the security of Bitcoin, but we also have a good user experience and fast transaction times? And so that's really where that idea was, kind of where Nakamoto was born. And then so a bunch of people in the community came together, figured out, okay, what's the best way to design this system? And it really resulted in a couple major changes to how the Stacks protocol actually works and how blocks are produced. So pre-Nakamoto, there's one Stacks block per Bitcoin block. They're anchored one-to-one with Bitcoin. Miners will get selected to append that next Stacks block. They'll append that single Stacks block, and then the next miner will be selected. And it just goes on down the list. So post-Nakamoto, actually, I'm going to back up one more second. There's one additional party in this proof of transfer system that I forgot to mention. So the reason it's called proof of transfer is because that Bitcoin that Stacks miners spend, it doesn't just get thrown away, it gets transferred to another participant in the protocol called stackers. And stackers are people that will lock up their Stacks tokens in exchange for a percentage of that Bitcoin reward. Pre-Nakamoto,
I
that
see.
really served as like it really served primarily an economic function of sort of signaling what is the real Stacks chain tip, because you can fork, okay, but this, for miners, this chain tip has no Stacks locked up in it. I'm not going to be appending my blocks to that one. This one, it's just a signal and a source of like economic security to have that amount, to have a certain amount locked up into the network. So then those participants were rewarded with that Bitcoin. So now we get into post Nakamoto. And the way that new blocks are added to the chain changes a bit. And this is really the key to understanding why the transaction throughput has gone up. So post Nakamoto, when a new miner is selected, they're not selected to mine a single block that's anchored one-to-one with Bitcoin. What they're selected for is what's called a tenure, which is a span of time corresponding to a Bitcoin block. And within that span of time, this single miner will append new Stacks blocks significantly faster. Roughly, this is an estimate, but like I think 5 to 10 seconds is like the current benchmark estimate right now. So this single miner will append what will end up being probably hundreds of Stacks blocks within a single Bitcoin block time span. So rather than
how
the block
long of a period of time?
for the
Like
tenure,
how many blocks will they do, and how long will that tenure be?
so the
During
tenure
their
will
time.
be, because it will be, the tenure is what is now anchored to the Bitcoin block time. So if you go with Bitcoin block times, it's an average of 10 minutes, but it can vary.
Okay.
And so
Okay.
that number of Stacks blocks that are produced in that time will just depend on how long the actual tenure is. But
Okay.
then when the next Bitcoin block rolls around, another transaction will happen where the miner is changed again, and then the next miner will take over for a tenure of another Stacks block, where they will be the sole miner successively appending new Stacks blocks to the chain. But then that leads us into, okay, but if there's a single miner in charge of producing several Stacks blocks, can't they do whatever they want? And under normal circumstances, yes, which is why the stackers now have an additional role of participating as signers. And so now what happens is a miner is not the party that actually does the appending of the new Stacks block. What a miner does is it will propose a new block and it will push that to the signers, who will then validate that it's a legitimate, valid block that doesn't break the consensus rules, and then they will actually append it to the chain. And so now these stackers have an additional responsibility of basically functioning as these sort of block validators. And so now there's more of a cooperative, there's two key parties in actually producing Stacks blocks, and they have a symbiotic relationship. So me as a miner, if I try to produce invalid blocks and I get blocked by the signer, well, then I don't get my Stacks reward for being a miner. But me as a signer, if I don't then fill my role of validating and appending those Stacks blocks, well, then I don't get my Bitcoin reward from proof of transfer. And so there's no, different from proof of stake, there's no concept of slashing in proof of transfer. So if I'm a stacker, I lock up my Stacks tokens, I now have the responsibility to validate these Stacks blocks. And I say responsibility more meaning that this is a software that people will run that will conduct these signing operations to validate these blocks. It's not like they're having to sit there manually, checking to make sure
every 10 minutes they're like, is it
That's what that was in my head. I was picturing that.
Nope. So they're running a software that will ensure that the new blocks being proposed fit the protocol rules. And as long as their software is up and running and functioning correctly, then they get their block rewards. So it's not that if I'm a signer stacker and I'm not fulfilling my duty, I don't get my Stacks tokens slashed. I just can't unlock them, and I don't get my Bitcoin reward. So I'm not actually not getting anything taken away from me. So it's a little bit of a different incentive mechanism there. But that's sort of how...
Hurts just as bad, though.
What's that?
So it hurts just as bad.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So that's how we were achieving the fast block, is now we've got several Stacks blocks being appended much more quickly in the time span of a single Bitcoin block. And so that's the fast block side of things. The other big change is that under Nakamoto, the Stacks chain won't be able to fork on its own. What will happen is when a new miner takes over, the previous chain tip will be set, and the new miner that takes over has to build on that chain tip. And if they don't, then the signers invalidate it on their end, and they cannot append any blocks to that chain. And so then what we have after that is every time a miner tenure changes, we again take the hash of all of the Stacks blocks that have happened up until that point, and we then write those to the Bitcoin chain, record that, and then that then sets the requirement for the next miner to have to build on top of that. And so this way we have a blockchain that is linear and doesn't fork on its own and has to track with Bitcoin and really has no other choice but to track with Bitcoin. And that's how we kind of achieve that now, that 100% Bitcoin finality. Because now at this point, what happens is in order for me to try to change a Stacks transaction, I would have to actually go back and undo the Bitcoin transaction that was recorded, that had recorded before. Because pre-Nakamoto, I as a miner, I can fork, and now that's the Stacks chain, but it's also now mine. And so I can now then go and reorg things as I please, only by having to override the Stacks security budget. But now with this new finality, because it can't fork, in order to do that, I would actually have to reorg the Bitcoin transactions itself that have recorded that history.
Wow. So you guys, you've figured out throughput and you figured out security on a brand new way. One thing I do think is interesting. So like originally when you only had a single party, which was the miners, which was making the decisions for appending and then also appending themselves, there was an issue because consensus wasn't there for what is a proper block. And now you produced a like consensus 50-50 between the stackers and the miners themselves. So the miner makes the proposition and the stackers decide whether or not that's a proper block. And since you have different incentive models for each party, they're incentivized to make sure that it's done correctly. Is that right?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
That's good.
Okay. Wow. Yeah. Wow. Very interesting. So when it's a party of one, there's an issue because people can kind of do their own thing. When it's a party of two, there's an opportunity for that consensus to produce a true system. So, okay. I guess I want to make this a little more like retail focused, moving out of the chain a little bit. So technically now you have a throughput of how many transactions can you do in a minute?
That depends. That those numbers are still kind of being looked at and benchmarked. So I'm not sure exactly what the TPS number is going to be, but from a user experience side, if I'm a user submitting a Stacks transaction, I should be able to expect that transaction to be confirmed within like several seconds. Like let's say 5 to 10 seconds is an estimate.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So as far as like technically what that gives opportunity for builders on the chain, because I was talking about with Alex Lab and some of the things that they were doing and like they could do lending, borrowing, but with the finality time, the issue or the transaction time when you send another or like open up a smart contract or whatever it may be, like perps, anything that requires time to be of the essence becomes, like not necessarily a good idea. So as far as like builders, what does this give an opportunity for retail and the builder side for, post Nakamoto? Like what can companies do now that they couldn't do prior, and what can retail do now that they couldn't do prior?
Yeah, so I think you hinted on the big one for DeFi, which is just anything that requires any amount of timing. You just couldn't really do before, because for a lot of operations you have to conduct as a user, if you're having to wait, best case scenario 10 minutes, there's just a lot of stuff that you just can't do because it's just too much time. And I'm not the best person to talk to about like exact DeFi opportunities, but what I would say is that from sort of like a bigger picture, just from the retail user side of things, and then from builders as well, is users don't want to use a chain that's annoying to use. And so if I'm a user and you're building something on Stacks and I go to test out your application and I'm like, just waited 20 minutes for this single transaction to confirm, like I just don't want to do that. I think what
Mm,
it really does on a bigger picture level is it unlocks new opportunity, because just for the simple fact that now the user experience is better. And so you'll have builders coming in that wouldn't have built before that now they will, because those transaction times are faster. Whether that's because they're building a product like Perps where they do need that fast time, or simply because they just didn't want to build on a chain that was that slow before and now they are. And then the same with users. That then just trickles down to the users. So me as a builder, I now know that I can build on a chain that has the best of both worlds where, okay, it's got this Bitcoin security, but at the same time, it's also actually really easy and enjoyable to use. So it's kind of, fitting into both of those models right there of the secure, but also the usable. Builders come in,
mm,
that's the case. Users are happier using their products, and then it just kind of trickles down, ultimately based on user experience, with still having that secure foundation that Bitcoin people and the builders that really care about that are gonna be able to leverage.
You think it's literally as simple as reducing friction produces higher people? It's not even like, do you think retail cares less about, and I'm not, you know, I'm not saying anything about anybody. I'm just saying when it comes to actually people using a blockchain or using functions, it's really less about like the underlying tech and more about the friction that they're experiencing just when they send a transaction, just that feeling in general.
I think that for most users, that is the case, that's the primary thing that they care
Wow.
about. But if you look at it another level deeper, um, and I'm painting with like a broad brush here. I don't think that's the case for everybody, but maybe I'll rephrase that a little bit and say I think it's enough to deter somebody from using a chain that they otherwise would, is
I
having
agree.
that poor user experience.
Mm,
But then at a deeper level, when you look at this concept of now we're getting into like the security and Bitcoin finality and aligning with the ethos of decentralization, that's going to bring in builders that otherwise wouldn't be building on the chain, because the developers and the tech people, they are like really interested in, okay, but what is this actually built on? Like what is this actually gonna let me do that I couldn't
mm,
do on other chains? And then you take that another level and you say, okay, are we going to be able to build these DeFi applications in a way that users are going to be able to suffer from less exploits than they have in previous DeFi chains? And then so I think you kind of get this waterfall effect of builders are interested in the security and the finality side of it. And then users are interested in the user experience side of it, while also still being able to leverage that side of it. And then the downstream effects of just being able to build more stable, secure applications, I think, while still keeping that user experience, I think over time is what's going to attract more and more people as they start to see things get more and more built out. And then I think on top of that, the draw is really like Bitcoin is I would say basically a household name at this point. Like even if somebody doesn't know what it is or how it
mm,
works, they've heard of it. And so the downside
yeah.
has always been, but you can't do much with it and it's hard to use. If we solve that problem in a way that still maintains that ethos of decentralization and security, look at that massive blue ocean opportunity that we've
Yeah.
just unlocked. Because people have been sitting here for over a decade now going, Bitcoin's great, Bitcoin's cool, I like Bitcoin, but I'm just going to hold it and not do anything with it. Well, now we're seeing this flood of people coming back that are basically going, oh, I can actually do stuff with this now. And I can do it in a way that's not me just handing my Bitcoin over to somebody else to have them do it for me and hope that they do the right thing with it.
Yeah, Kenny, I have a question here. Actually, I think would be good for this timing. So, if someone, because you're right, it is a household name. Most people have heard of it. I guess I'll have a two-part question here. Like for developers who come in, they're not really crypto native, but they're interested in it. They are a developer. They can code and all this stuff. They're watching this podcast. Maybe they're like, okay, I'm in. Nakamoto sounds cool. Stacks is cool. I want to jump in. What would be their like literal step next? And then for people who are crypto native and they're a developer and they're also saying, this is dope, I want to get involved, what is their next step?
Yeah, so for the people that are not crypto native, that aren't familiar with all this stuff, I'd probably send them to, it's a course I made called the Bitcoin Primer. The URL is bitcoinprimer.dev. It's free, but the reason I created it was really to provide an introduction to people that are like interested in Bitcoin, but they've never really built anything in, on crypto in Web3, any of that stuff. It kind of goes through, the first half of it is more of like a conceptual sort of like why Bitcoin, how does it work? And then it leads into, okay, how do you build things with stacks? For people that are crypto natives that are already familiar with the conceptual side of things, I'd probably just send them straight to the documentation because I've got some like quick start tutorials and jumping off points there. And that is just docs.stacks.co. And then the primary stacks.co website is also just a really good place to go and just get like a high level introduction to everything about how it works in the ecosystem, a little bit more about the proof of transfer model, the smart contract language, all that. But those between those three places, those will give people enough of a jumping off point to then go down whatever rabbit hole they want to go down from there, depending on their background and what they're interested in.
Awesome. Awesome. And we'll link all that stuff down below for people who are interested, because that's typically like where people go wrong, I think, is they hear something, they're like, that sounds cool. And then they're like, oh, I got to do something. And then they just forget about it and they just never get around to it. So guys, if you're interested in that, definitely hit those links below. And also in Spaces, we'll probably talk about that a little bit. That way people can go straight from Twitter. Is that probably, by the way, the best place to find you guys and stay up to date is the Twitter for Stacks, or is there another place?
Yeah, the Twitter's really good. If you do go to that stacks.co website, there's a whole section on like how to get involved in the community.
Awesome.
Twitter's definitely a good one. If you're on Discord, the Stacks Discord is really, really active. There's tons of people in there, so that would be another good place to go. And that's linked on the Stacks website as well.
Nice, nice. And then as far as other people too, not even just devs, but like retail builders, stackers, people who want to get involved in that side of it, do you think, would you also send them to the main website and then they'll probably find their way from there? Or is there like a Discord community, a Telegram community they should go into that's more helpful?
I would say main website first, to kind of get your bearings and just get a high level introduction. And then from there, joining the Discord to just ask specific questions is probably the best place to go there.
Nice, nice. Yeah, Charlie, over to you. Do you have any other final questions here?
Yeah, I think that's like, to be honest, I think that there's a lot of cool opportunities just because there's like 3 different pieces you can be involved with. Like when you want to join proof of work with Bitcoin, the price to entry to be involved with the blockchain is extremely expensive. But what's cool is that you guys, from how much does somebody, so say they want to be a stacker, like you have people that are the miners put up Bitcoin, but then the stackers will put up a certain amount of your native token. How much is the minimum to put up of that token for them to get involved?
Yeah, so the answer to that depends on how you're going to be a stacker. If you want to be a solo stacker, which is where at that point you're post Nakamoto taking on the responsibility of running your own signer and stacking your own stacks tokens, there's a dynamic minimum that adjusts based on how much liquid stacks there is in the ecosystem. I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but if you go to the stacks.co website, there's a stacking page specifically on there. So you do need a minimum amount if you want to be a solo stacker. However, there are several stacking pools that operate right now, including a liquid stacking one. So stacking down the first liquid stacking protocol that launched. And then so in that case, the minimum, depending on the pool, is either pretty low, like 100 stacks, or non-existent. It just depends on how the pool is setting things up. But yeah, again, that stacks.co, there's a stacking page specifically that'll walk you through like not only what stacking is and how it works, but how you can actually start doing it. And there's several different ways depending on, you know, what kind of a trust assumption you want versus if you want to do solo or pool, if you want to do liquid stacking or standard stacking, all that different kind of, it'll walk you through all those different options there. And then one other thing that I did want to get into a little bit before we drop off, talking about the opportunities part of it specifically. And this is something that I try to hammer this point home a lot when I'm giving like developer workshops to developers who aren't super familiar with stacks, is to give kind of a short answer to the what opportunities are there. Look at the Ethereum DeFi ecosystem. 99% of that doesn't exist on Bitcoin. Build all of that. Like that is the one of the biggest opportunities out there right now. Is Ethereum has proven out that the market demand is there for a lot of these use cases. We've been able to see some of the iterations of that and say, okay, that didn't work, that worked, but it needed this adjustment. Holy crap, this one could work great on Bitcoin. I'm going to go build that. So the short answer to what opportunities are out there is there's like $1 trillion market that's just sitting there waiting to be built out. That's already been built out in Ethereum that we can now start to build out on the Bitcoin side of things.
Wow. Yeah, no, and the nice part is not in like an unkind way, but they did all the failure points first,
Mhm.
and they found out what worked and what didn't work in a really good way. And so I guess for you guys, adoption is probably the biggest on how many builders you can possibly get to participate within your chain, just because people are interested in different protocols or interested in different opportunities. So for you guys, are you at like if somebody wants to build, just kind of like bring it on stage, or is it kind of a slow, is there like a process where somebody has to like be vetted prior to building, or how does that look at least?
No, no vetting at all. It's totally like open network. Like anybody that wanted to could jump on the documentation, learn how to build it, and build and launch something at any point without ever talking to a person. Um,
Mm,
on the flip side of things, there are people that, do want some support along the way. And so we provide that as far as both from like a technical perspective of like, I'm a developer and I need help wrapping my head around Clarity. There's all kinds of resources for that. And then also from more of like the sort of the business side of things. Um, that's the other nice thing about where the market's at right now and what the opportunities are is investors are like really hungry for Bitcoin projects right now. And so investors are throwing money at people that are building on Bitcoin, especially on Bitcoin L2s. That narrative is
mm.
like very popular right now. And so there's a huge opportunity there. And there's the only barrier to entry is just, your willingness to just go do it. There's
Do it.
no like,
Wow.
there's no vetting process. There's no anything like that. So yeah, if you have an idea that you want to build out on Saks, start building it because in all likelihood, there's a use case for it and probably a market opportunity there.
Very cool.
Mm. E- Well, even we'll have to segue after this, but even like if art and ordinals is doing so well, the same with NFTs, like any type of broad functionality, because people will get into something just because the provenance of it even existing. So I feel like just to not to mitigate anybody's dream, if anybody's listening to this, like people are interested just in the idea of something being new, not even necessarily the use case or the communal aspect of it. So if you have an idea that you can build on top of the chain, it has some type of use case, or maybe not even. Maybe it's just community. I think that there's probably an opportunity for it because even looking at ordinals, like it's a community-based picture inscribed on the blockchain. We're not
Yeah.
talking about like revolutionary, like decentralized finance, like where people are
Right.
lending, any of that stuff, dude. It literally is just community provenance and it's worth millions and millions of dollars. If you look at OMB, I think the market cap is like $220 million, and it's like MS Paint pictures. So I'm not saying I'm not, telling everybody to go do that, but I am saying there is something to Bitcoin layer two. And if anybody's interested, please go check it out. So yeah, I think that's good for me. Is there anything you want to cover, Kenny? Anything you'd like to go over for last closing thoughts?
I don't think so. I think we kind of went over everything. Yeah, those last few resources, I definitely recommend everybody
Yeah.
go check out, whether you're a developer or just a user or potential founder. That stacks.co website is really designed to be kind of a jumping off point for whatever you're looking to do in the ecosystem.
Awesome.
Mm.
Awesome. And we'll make sure to link all that down below. And if you want to shout anyone out, this would be the time before we wrap up. So if you want to shout anyone out, the Saks team, maybe, I know you guys have the havings coming up, all big, big days coming up for you guys. So
Yeah.
Yeah, man, there's an endless list of people I could shout out right now, but the core team, the core developers have been working just like absolutely nonstop to make sure that this thing gets released on time, that it's stable, secure, all that stuff. And so yeah, just huge shout out to everybody working in the ecosystem right now. There's so much
Mm.
happening.
yeah,
It's just really impressive to watch, especially when you look at like it's a decentralized ecosystem. There's people from dozens of different entities and people that are doing their own thing, contracting and freelancing that are all coming together to build this protocol. And so seeing all those people collaborate and come together and work as hard as they are to launch this all with this same vision of how do we build this decentralized economy on Bitcoin has been really cool.
the coolest,
Wow.
man. The coolest. Charlie, any last thoughts?
No, that's it for me. I want to go like deeper into like how all the tech works, but I feel like from a high level and without needing another 2-hour conversation, we've covered some really good territory without getting into like the subtle nuances of all the pieces of tech. So thank you so much for your time, Kenny. I appreciate you coming out, man, and I
Yeah, we
appreciate you
appreciate
too, Cade. So
yeah, well, we're
yeah,
gonna have
man,
weekly
I think
spaces
that's
with
it.
yeah, we're gonna have weekly spaces with Stacks. It looks to be all about Stacks, all about Bitcoin. All on Fridays 1 p.m. PST it looks to be. So
Yep.
also everyone who's watching, we appreciate you. Hope you enjoyed the discussion. Looking forward to more of these Bitcoin spaces. And happy having. Hopefully it's we'll see what happens on the price action side of it. But man, it's gonna be a crazy, crazy time to be alive. And yeah, again, Kenny, appreciate your time. If you guys want to follow him on Twitter, it is Ken the Rogers. And then also Stacks, make sure you give them a follow as well. Everyone have a wonderful day. I'm Cade. This is Charlie. This is Wolfhead 3 out.